They watched you before they knew your name. Eyes hidden behind friendly smiles, rehearsed laughter, and the kind of small talk that masks intention like dust, veiling a dagger. You felt it, not in what was said, but in what was never spoken. The silence around you wasn't absent, it was design. Something in you unsettled them. You walked differently, thought differently, listened longer than they were comfortable with. You didn't rush to speak. You didn't beg to be seen. That made you dangerous. They mistook your quiet for weakness. They thought your silence meant you didn't know, but you saw everything. The sideways glances when you entered a room, the sudden stops in conversation, the curious way your name came up in circles you never stepped into. At first it confused, then it amused, and then it confirmed something ancient, that the moment a person refuses to perform for the crowd begins to conspire. They needed a version of you that they could predict. You refused. You weren't chaos, but you weren't compliance either. And in a world built on masks that made you a threat, you played the long game. You watched, you cataloged, you buried information like seeds, not to forget, but to grow. You knew this moment would come, not when they were strong, but when they felt bold enough to believe they had won. Power makes them reckless, comfort makes them sloppy. That's when architects of lies begin to believe their own blueprints. That's when they leave cracks. And you were born in the cracks. In the dark corners of your mind you kept notes, not written but etched into memory with surgical precision. The day they lied, the night they twisted your truth into a performance for others, the way they smiled while stealing pieces of you. You never interrupted, you never stopped, because some battles are not fought, they are allowed to happen. So the enemy walks into their own trap. You then to or to presal, quodnom or to or ditu. You've always felt alone in a crowded room, not because you lacked connection, but because you could see through it. Most people exist as reflections of what others expect. You never played that role, and so they gave you labels: cold, distant, difficult. They needed a narrative. You didn't. That terrified them. There is something surgical about your silence. It cuts deeper than noise ever could. You learned this from pain, the kind no one asked about, the kind no one stayed to witness. They thought they buried you in silence, but you were studying the soil, measuring the weight of their word, waiting for the wind to shift. Now the wind has shifted. It starts slow, a misplaced sentence, a contradiction in their story, a flicker of doubt in someone else's eye. You sense it like animals sense storms before the first thunder, but you don't move yet. You remain still, because stillness is power misunderstood by those who rely on motion to feel alive. You've waited in the shadow, not as a prisoner but as a strategy. They thought they could expose you, but exposure means light, and you've lived with darkness as a companion, not a curse. You've known betrayal intimately, shared meals with it, learned its language. It can't surprise you now. This is not your revenge. This is your revelation. They came for you with polished smiles and well-practiced voices, dressed in borrowed confidence and cloaked in moral superiority. Their words were sharp, but empty, a theater of righteousness designed to pierce, not reveal. They painted you in their shadow, hoping the world would never see the light behind your eyes, and for a moment it almost worked. Their stories moved fast. The crowd led, and then the narrative was clean, controlled, symmetrical, until it wasn't, because something didn't align. A note too rehearsed, a gesture too forced. The eyes of the watcher, the real ones, the quiet ones, began to narrow. You said nothing, and in that silence something primal shifted. They thought silence meant weakness. They mistook restraint for retreat. But your quiet wasn't surrender, it was a mirror. And when liars stand before mirrors, they don't see themselves, they see the cracks. Whispers became static, static became distant. Their certainty, once absolute, began to rot at the edges. Words they once hurled with conviction now echoed back with strange distortion. They began to sweat beneath the heat of their own spotlight. The ones who came to crucify began defending their own timeline. their own receipts, their own contradict. One glitch in the story, then two, then a flood. The timeline unraveled like a thread pulled from a garment sewn in deception. And you watched, not as a victim but as a force. You were never playing defense. You were the storm behind the curtain, the one they didn't see because they never looked past their own reflection. You were patient because you to shout. The truth doesn't shout, it waits. It doesn't chase the stage. It becomes the stage when the actors forget their line. They begin to turn on each other. Small fractures form between them, like cracks in stained glass. The alliances built on mutual resentment and borrowed narratives start to shatter. You notice the shift first in their eyes. Not panic, not guilt, but fear. The kind of fear born from a sudden realization. They've summoned something they can no longer. You were never just a person to them. You were a symbol. A projection, a story they need to collapse. But symbols don't collapse, they evolve. Now the watcher forward, not to see you fall, but to witness what rises from the place they tried to bury. The ones who once echoed their stories begin to ask questions. A ripple the crowd, a subtle turning of people start to see the performance, the choreography, the script beneath the surface, and beneath the fear. Not yours, theirs, because in trying to expose you they exposed themselves. Every mask they wore begins to rot on a stained fiction. Every carefully crafted line becomes an anchor tied to a sinking ship. And still, you remain still, not as a statue, but as something something that doesn't move unless it must. Something that knows how stories end when they're not built on truth, but on fear as virtue. Their world to buckle, their narrative no. You remain unshaken, not untouched but they aim to drag you into, but chaos devoured. You didn't need to fight their fire, you simply let it burn. It was nothing but smoke, and questioned the weight of your silence, standing like a monk where their empire used to. They thought the silence meant submission, that your lack of sense was an admission, but silence is rarely a surrender. Sometimes it's a recalibration. While they fed the world their version of you, cut from fragments and polished performance, something darker to move the surface, unseen, unheard, denied. The watchers, not the public, not the loud, but the ones who really feel the fracture. They didn't speak, not yet, but the feeling had begun to twist in their gut. Something. You never posted rebuttal, never launched a counter, just silence. And in that void acted your to be swallowed whole, but instead, like smoke from a fire no sort, then they listened to, and something inside, the word, they watched, not with, but curiosity, because the narrative felt crafted, and the had seen magician fall for the saint twice, in the quiet corners, where the forget, a novice, comment a posted forum suddenly resurfaced. At times, a screen recorded, files shared, not by you but by their voice once made the story, not violent, but like glass under, silent, inevitable. And once the first crack formed, what they didn't understand, attention is no longer power, belief, and belief is volatile, it's ancient, tribal, it doesn't respond to polished, responds to truth, or at least the scent of it. And your silence reeked of something that felt more real than their performance. The algorithm, like a god drunk on dopamine and data, noticed the shift. It began feeding people what they weren't supposed to see. A 7-second clip out of context, a leaked message with the wrong timestamp, a search suggestion that leads not to your downfall but to their contradictions. It wasn't magic, it was math, and their equations were starting to bleed errors. They had planned your destruction like a blueprint, step by step. Viral exposure, emotional manipulation, character assassination. But what they forgot was the variable they couldn't quantify: trust. Not with the masses, but with the few, the quiet, the watchers, the broken ones who see patterns where others see noise, the ones who've survived betrayal so often they can hear it humming beneath every fake smile. And those people, they started watching again, but this time with a different lens, not as critics, as sentinels. And so the algorithm, impartial and brutal, began shifting. It stopped favoring their outrage and started amplifying your mystery. And that was the moment everything changed. They thought they were loud enough to bury you, but they didn't understand what silence does. It gathers weight, it sharpens clarity, It invites the patient to look deeper. And now those who came to witness your fall are beginning to question who really built the ledge. They expected raid, a loud rebuttal, a frantic defense, something desperate. But instead you returned with silence, the kind that unnerves, the kind that makes people question what they thought they understood. No fire, no fury, just you, steady, calm, unreadable, like a shadow slipping back into the room you were dragged from. You didn't arrive to argue. You didn't come back to prove anything. You came to reveal what they swore no one would ever see. Your presence alone was a disruption. The lies they had so carefully arranged began to twitch. Their confidence cracked, not with a bang but a flicker. The air changed when you spoke, not in volume but in weight. You didn't attack them. You simply unfolded truth, piece by piece, as if peeling back ancient wallpaper to show the rot beneath. Screenshots, recordings, timelines, patterns, names they forgot they whispered, alliances they thought hidden. You brought it all like a priest laying relics on an altar. Cold, clean, undeniable, and still, no rage. That's what made it worse for them. You didn't need chaos. You had precision, and precision cuts deeper than any scream ever could. They had crafted an illusion, an entire world where you were the villain, the deceiver, the mask. But now with every file, every connection, every thread you pulled, it was their reality that began to unspool. They stumbled, not from what you said, but from what they couldn't explain. Your truth didn't destroy their fiction. It revealed that it was never stable to begin with. You weren't defending yourself. You were revealing a map, one that showed who was watching quietly from the beginning. The unseen hands that helped you collect. The quiet allies who had once bowed their heads but never turned their backs. People they had dismissed, voices they had silenced, now speaking, now rising. What they didn't realize, what they never could understand, was that you never walked alone. You walked in echoes, in codes, in fragments of knowledge passed silently between those who refused to be erased. You weren't returning to reclaim a throne. You were never playing their game. You let them build the stage, let them light the fire, let them dance in their imagined victory. And then you walked through the flames, untouched, because you never feared exposure. You feared distraction. And now, stripped of noise, there is nothing between your truth and the audience but clarity. That is what kills them. The fact that you didn't fight, that you didn't flinch, that you didn't break. You just showed up, and reality warped around you. There was no dramatic crescendo, just the unraveling, quiet, inescapable. One by one, their statements collapsed under their own contradiction. Their faces, once so confident, began to twitch. Their allies pulled away, eyes turned, questions multiplied. You didn't dismantle them, you revealed them. You didn't attack their words, you illuminated their absence of substance. And in doing so, you altered the axis of control, because power doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't plead to be understood. True power returns not to be heard, but to be felt. And that's what you became in that moment. Not a voice, but a weight pressing against the illusion. And slowly, mercilessly, that illusion began to crack. Not from force, but from knowing that you never left. You were just waiting for the right silence. They thought the collapse would begin with you, but it began with them. Not loudly, not all at once. It began like rot beneath paint, silent, slow, irreversible. Their voices, once so sharp, start to tremble on the edges. Their eyes shift mid-sentence. Something fractures. The cracks are small at first, invisible to most, but you see them. You always did. Whispers circulate through corridors they can no longer control. People begin asking questions, not about you, but about the ones who pointed first. The irony is precise. The more they tried to drag your name into the dark, the more light poured over theirs. It's not exposure that kills them. It's the revelation that they were never who they claimed to be. One slip, one file, one contradiction, and the whole architecture starts to shake. They attempt to patch it with noise, statements, denials, rehearsed outrage. But the digital ether has memory, script, old footage, deleted comments resurrected like ghosts. Each piece connects, not in your favor, but in truth's favor. The machine they once fed turns on them. Algorithms they worshipped refuse to obey. Their followers, once loyal and loud, grow quiet. Some disappear, others turn, and the silence that follows, it's colder than betrayal. They try to play the victim now, rewrite their own script, reframe the narrative as a misunderstanding, but the tone doesn't land the same. Their performance is off, the mask is slipping, and this time, the audience sees the sweat. You don't gloat, you don't even speak, because you know something ancient. Sometimes the most devastating act is to let people witness their own unraveling. No push, no retaliation, just gravity pulling the false toward collapse. Inside their world, panic sets in. DMs they thought were private begin to leak. Collaborators vanish. Past allies issue silence, not support. A house built on illusion has no foundation, and when it falls it does not warn. Their hands once pointed outward, now they point at each other. Blame becomes currency, loyalty a liability. The truth isn't what destroyed them, it was the weight of maintaining the lie. You feel the shift, not as a celebration, but as confirmation. Everything they accused you of, everything they distorted, it no longer matters, not because it's cleared, but because it's irrelevant. The narrative they tried to create burned down, with them still inside it, and now even their own reality begins to question itself. What was truth? What was strategy? What was fear, disguised as righteousness? Their names don't ring the same anymore. When spoken, there's a pause, a hesitation, like history trying to decide whether they are worth remembering. You walk past their ruins, not as a victor, but as a witness, because in the end you didn't fight them. You simply outlived their illusion, and survival, in silence, is the most brutal revelation of all. They didn't fear your failures, they never did. In fact, they counted on them. They assumed, like all the others, you'd break yourself before you ever broke the system, that you'd self-destruct quiet, obediently, so they wouldn't have to dirty their hands. But you didn't. You didn't implode. You adapted. You analyzed. You became quiet, calculating, patient, and that terrified them. You weren't supposed to survive the exile. You weren't supposed to grow sharper in isolation. But every time they whispered your name in mockery, you heard it like prophecy. Every betrayal was a cipher, every silence, a message. They built narratives like cages, thinking you'd shrink to fit them. But you were never made of stories. You were made of substance. They tried to map your intentions, predict your next move. But how do you read the pattern of someone who writes in shadows? They tried to destroy you, not because you were dangerous, but because you were undomestic. You didn't perform the acceptable emotions. You didn't need their applause. You moved in ways they couldn't anticipate. You saw through their tactics, the doublespeak, the moral veneers painted over raw ambition. You saw their hunger to be adored, even at the cost of truth. And worse, you didn't fear it. You didn't play the game, which meant you were immune to its punishment. That made you a threat to the entire illusion. They feared what you revealed without speaking. That quiet competence, that unplaceable intensity, that unspoken knowing in your eyes. You reminded them of something older, something buried, something they thought the world had forgotten. Discipline without praise, power without theatrics. You were the contradiction to their performance. And in a world obsessed with performance, authenticity is a weapon. So they orchestrated it. The subtle campaigns, the concerned voices, the drip-fed distortion of your image, not because you were guilty, but because they needed you to be. If they could turn you into a villain, they wouldn't have to face the mirror you held up to their faces. If they could convince enough people you were dangerous, they could convince themselves they were good. But they underestimated something crucial, your capacity to hold pressure like a forge. They mistook silence for surrender. They mistook stillness for weakness. They forgot that some seeds must be buried in darkness before they rise. And while they threw dirt on your name, you were growing roots, quiet, patient, deep. not to return, but to ascend. They don't understand you because they've never had to live without approval. You have. You were forged in it, molded by the absence of applause, the cold hands of betrayal, the long corridors of loneliness that taught you how to see what others ignore. They were taught to obey perception. You were taught to read beneath it. And now, even as their structures begin to crumble, they don't fully grasp why. They still think it's about you, but it never was. You were a symbol, a fracture line in their carefully manufactured order. They tried to destroy you because you reminded the world what can't be fabricated: integrity, endurance, the kind of silence that speaks louder than their noise. They thought you were just one person, but they were never fighting you. They were fighting everything they pretend not to fear. They took your name and made it hollow, filled it with static and shadows, hoping no one would notice the theft. For a while they succeeded. You watched your reflection distort in the eyes of strangers, twisted by hands that spoke sweet poison and performed outrage like theater. You said nothing, not because you couldn't, but because you understood what they didn't. That silence is not absence, it is pressure, and when pressure builds long enough, it either breaks the vessel or remakes it. You stopped playing their game. You stopped explaining your humanity to people who traded theirs for applause. You stepped back into the void they left behind, and there, in that cold, untouched place, you began again, not to repair what was ruined, but to rewrite what had never been told truthfully. Every word they tried to bury became stone. Every lie they threw at you, mortar. You weren't rebuilding a reputation. You were building a monument, and not one made to be admired, but to endure. This time you don't tell your story for them. You don't raise your voice to clear your name in rooms that were always designed to echo only theirs. You speak in code, in rhythm, in undertones. They will never understand. Your message is not public, it's encrypted in experience. Those who have walked the same dark hallways will hear it. They'll feel it, like a vibration through the floorboards of a world that tried to silence them too. You are not just writing a story, you are sending out a signal. There's a strange kind of power that comes from being hunted, a sharpening of instinct, a tempering of fire. They tried to destroy you with half-truths, never realizing they were training you to move through the world without needing to be seen. You became smoke, then shadow, then something older, something unnameable. When you speak now, it is not to be understood, it is to be remembered. They once defined you by what they claimed you were hiding, but now they're the ones who flinch when your name reappears. They sense the shift. The air moves differently when you enter, not louder, heavier. This is what they never predicted. That exposure only works on those who fear the light. But you were forged in the dark, and what is written in darkness echoes louder than anything said in daylight. You are no longer reacting to what they said. You are writing what comes after, the next chapter, the unspoken one. They want the past to stay frozen, but you've learned the most dangerous act is movement, forward, silent, precise. Your existence becomes prophecy, a warning, a myth in motion. They cannot follow where you're going, not because you blocked the path, but because they cannot survive the terrain. Your story is no longer something they can quote, clip, or distort. It lives now where they cannot reach, in minds that see, in hearts that remember what betrayal feels like, in the rhythm of people rising without permission. You are not a moment, you are momentum, and the ones still watching, they see it too. They don't say it, but they feel the shift. You rewrote the story, and this time you wrote it in ink they cannot erase. They fade quietly, not with the storm they promised, not with the spectacle they rehearsed, but with a soft, choking silence. No grand collapse, just vanishing. One by one they turn into shadows that no longer cast weight. Their voices lose edge, their posts gather dust. The audience they once fed on turns elsewhere, not out of loyalty to you but out of hunger for truth. and disgust for illusion. They had the stage, they held the light, and still they chose to weaponize it against someone they could never understand. You weren't destroyed because you weren't built the way they were. Your foundation wasn't applause. It was absence. It was the quiet hours, the unspeakable nights, the wounds stitched together with teeth clenched and eyes wide open in the dark. They never expected you to survive. That was their first mistake. But their second, and far more fatal, was believing survival was your ceiling. You didn't just survive them. You transformed in the fire they lit. Every betrayal forged something sharper inside you. Not armor. No, armor is reactive. What you grew was internal. A code, a language, a calm so deep it became terrifying. You learned the art of disappearing in plain sight, not hiding, observing. You stopped explaining. You started becoming. Now when you speak, the world pauses, not out of fear, out of recognition. They don't know what you are, not fully, but they know what you're not, and that's enough to unsettle. You are no longer a name to defame. You are a presence to navigate, an anomaly, a ghost with memory, and the ones who tried to break your shape are now tangled in the ruins of their own design. Every lie they crafted about you clings to them instead, like smoke that refuses to wash off. They blamed you for the fire, but you weren't the match. You were the oxygen. Your power now is not loud. It's not visible to the untrained eye, but it's there, in the shifts of conversation, in the They feel when your silence stretches just a little too long. You live in the pause, in the spaces they can't fill anymore. You're not chasing redemption. You're not interested in clearing your name. You never needed clean one. What you needed, and finally gained, was freedom from the narrative they built to contain you. And now you write your own. Somewhere deep, beneath the surface of what pink they know, there's a current they can't trace. That current is you, always moving, never still. You don't announce your steps. You leave footprints in bone, the kind that can't be erased. They tried to expose you, but truth isn't revealed in drama. It's revealed in endurance, in the quiet consistency of presence. While they chased spotlight, you became shadow, and in that shadow, you found something they were never meant to touch: clarity, precision, and peace with being misunderstood. Now when others attempt to tear you open, they find something they don't expect. Not chaos, not fury, but mirrors, clean, still, surgical, reflecting their own distortions back at you. No longer resist. You simply let people reveal themselves. That's all it takes. You don't fight fire with fire. You let them burn alone. And somehow through all the noise you remained untouched. Not because you hid from the war, but because you became the terrain it could no longer navigate.